The thread snapped just as Victoria Ashworth raised my dress between two manicured fingers like it was roadkill. I watched 3 months of my life dangle there in that sterile white studio, every hand-sewn bead catching the harsh fluorescent light that made everything look cheap and desperate. The irony wasn't lost on me that my emerald green creation, the one I'd poured my soul into, was being held by a woman wearing a knockoff Chanel that probably cost more than my rent. "You call this fashion?" Her voice cut through the silence like broken glass, and I swear I felt something inside me die right there on the spot. "This looks like something a child would make in home economics class." The other judges started snickering before she even finished her sentence. Marcus Chen, the so-called visionary who built his empire stealing from struggling designers, was practically doubled over with laughter. Sarah Williams, whose only claim to fame was marrying into old money, covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were cruel and delighted. And there was James Morrison, nodding along like a bobblehead, desperate to fit in with people who would drop him the second he stopped being useful. "The stitching is uneven," Victoria continued, her voice getting louder, more theatrical, playing to the cameras that I knew would broadcast my humiliation to thousands of viewers. "The design is pedestrian, and, frankly, I'm embarrassed for you." I stood there clutching my portfolio so tight my knuckles had gone completely white, feeling every dream I'd ever had crumble in real time. 3 years of fashion school, working double shifts at a coffee shop to pay for fabric, sleeping 4 hours a night to meet deadlines, all of it reduced to 30 seconds of public destruction. The worst part wasn't even their words, it was the way they were looking at me. Like I was nothing. Like I was a joke that had walked into their world by mistake. I spent months on every detail, I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over their continued laughter. Each bead was placed by hand, the pattern is completely original, and the construction techniques are... "Oh, honey," Victoria interrupted, her voice dripping with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Did you just say you spent months on this? Months?" She turned to the other judges with exaggerated shock. "Darling, a real designer could whip up something better than this in an afternoon. The fact that you spent months just proves you don't have what it takes." The laughter got louder. Marcus was actually wiping tears from his eyes. Sarah was recording the whole thing on her phone, probably already planning how she'd share this moment with her circle of trust fund friends. And James, pathetic James, was laughing the hardest of all. Like destroying me would somehow elevate his own pathetic career. I felt something wet on my cheek and realised I was crying. Not the dignified, single tear of a movie heroine, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook my whole body. My portfolio fell from my trembling hands, spilling sketches and fabric samples across the polished concrete floor. Designs I'd worked on for years, concepts that had kept me up at night with excitement, scattered like garbage at their feet. "Security!" Victoria called out, her voice bored now that the entertainment was over. "Please escort Miss..." She glanced at her notes with theatrical confusion. "Catherine, out of the building, and make sure she takes her arts and crafts project with her." The walk through those rain-soaked streets afterward was the longest of my life. I was still wearing that emerald dress, now looking as broken and defeated as I felt. Every step squelched in the puddles, soaking through my shoes and chilling me to the bone. People stared as I passed, this crazy woman in a fancy dress crying her eyes out in the middle of downtown. I didn't care, nothing mattered anymore. I kept replaying their words in my head like a torture device I couldn't turn off. Uneven stitching, pedestrian design, arts and crafts project. Each phrase hit me like a physical blow over and over until I thought I might actually collapse right there on the sidewalk. By the time I reached my tiny studio apartment, I was completely numb. I sat on my bed, still in that wet dress, staring at the business card Victoria had mockingly handed me as I left. "Here's the number. For a lovely community college that offers basic sewing classes, she'd said with that poisonous smile. Maybe start there and work your way up. I must have sat there for hours, just staring at that card until the letters blurred together. My phone kept buzzing with notifications, probably friends wanting to know how the presentation went, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The dress had dried stiff against my skin, making every breath feel laboured and wrong. That night, I made a decision that would change everything, though I had no way of knowing it then. I was done. Done with fashion, done with dreams, done with believing that talent and hard work meant anything in a world controlled by people like Victoria Ashworth. I gathered every sketch, every fabric sample, every piece of clothing I'd ever made, and I threw it all away. 3 years of my life went into those garbage bags, but I felt nothing as I dragged them to the dumpster behind my building. The next morning, I applied for a job at an insurance company. Within a week, I'd packed up my sewing machine and sold it to a pawn shop for $50. I told myself I was being practical, realistic, mature. I told myself that some people are meant to create, and others are meant to live ordinary lives. I convinced myself that Victoria and her friends had done me a favour by showing me the truth before I wasted any more time on impossible dreams. But here's what I didn't know then. What I couldn't have possibly imagined. Sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of humour. Sometimes when you think your story is over, it's really just beginning. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people who destroy you give you exactly the motivation you need to destroy them right back. I lived 9 more years in that grey, colourless world I'd built for myself. 9 years of insurance claims and office parties and pretending that the fire inside me had been completely extinguished. I got good at it too, the pretending. I almost convinced myself that I was happy, that this was enough, that Catherine the designer had been a foolish girl who deserved what happened to her. But late at night, when I thought no one was looking, I'd still sketch. Just little things on napkins or the margins of work documents. Dresses I'd never make, designs I'd never share, dreams I'd never speak out loud. The muscle memory was still there, the vision still clear as a crystal, but I'd learned to keep it locked away where it couldn't hurt me anymore. The night I died, I was walking home from another soul-crushing day at the office when it happened. I don't remember the impact, just the screech of brakes and then nothing. They told me later that I'd been clutching something in my hand so tightly they had to pry my fingers open. It was Victoria's business card, still in my purse after all those years, worn soft from the times I'd taken it out, just to remind myself why I'd given up. The last thing I remember thinking before everything went black was how pathetic it was that I'd carry that woman's mockery with me for so long. How I'd let 30 seconds of cruelty define 9 years of my life. How I'd been so afraid of failing again that I'd never even tried. And then I woke up in my childhood bedroom, 16 years old again, with 10 years of fashion knowledge burning bright in my mind, and a very, very different plan for my future. The first thing I noticed wasn't the pink walls covered in fashion magazine cutouts, or the ancient sewing machine humming in the corner. It was my hands. 16-year-old hands, smooth and unmarked by years of paperwork and defeated dreams, but they were trembling with knowledge that shouldn't exist. I sat up in that narrow twin bed, and the memories hit me like a freight train, not the fuzzy recollections of childhood, but crystal clear visions of a future that had already played out. Victoria Ashworth's next collection would debut in 3 months. The same collection she'd steal from a young designer named Elena Vasquez, who would never know her work had been copied until it was too late. Marcus Chen was about to launch his revolutionary sustainable line, built entirely on the unpaid labour of desperate interns who'd never see credit or compensation. And Sarah Williams was planning her grand entrance into fashion journalism by destroying 3 emerging designers with scathing reviews she hadn't even written herself. I knew it all. every backstabbing move, every stolen design, every career they'd built on the bones of people like me. But more importantly, I knew every trend that was coming, every technique that would revolutionize the industry, every single detail that would matter over the next decade. The knowledge burned in my mind like fire, precise and devastating. My mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, calling me for breakfast like she had every morning of my original childhood. But this time, instead of stumbling down in my pajamas to complain about school, I was already planning my first move. The fashion competition that had destroyed me wouldn't happen for 10 years, but the foundations of my enemies' empires were being laid right now, in coffee shops and design studios across the city. I walked to my old vanity mirror and stared at my teenage face, unmarked by the years of defeat that would come later. My eyes were brighter, my skin clearer, but behind that youthful exterior was the mind of a woman who'd learned exactly how cruel this industry could be. They thought they'd broken me with their laughter, but they'd actually given me the most powerful weapon imaginable: complete knowledge of their future moves. The sewing machine in the corner caught my eye, the same one I'd sold for $50 in my previous life. But now, looking at it with a decade of hindsight, I could see possibilities I'd never imagined before. My fingers itched to create, but not the naive designs of my original teenage years. This time, I would craft pieces that would make Victoria's stolen collections look like amateur hour. I spent that first day sketching designs that wouldn't be invented for years, techniques that wouldn't emerge until 2028, silhouettes that would define the next decade of fashion. Each line I drew was deliberate, calculated, devastating. I wasn't just planning clothes anymore. I was planning the complete and utter destruction of everyone who'd ever laughed at my emerald dress. The genius of my position hit me as I worked. They were all still small-time players, still building their reputations, still vulnerable. Victoria was working as an assistant at a mid-tier magazine, kissing up to editors who barely knew her name. Marcus was struggling to get investors for his first startup, the one that would eventually make him millions through exploitation. Sarah was still Daddy's little princess, playing at being a fashion student while her trust fund paid for everything. But I knew their weaknesses. Victoria's desperate need for approval from anyone with power, Marcus's willingness to steal ideas when his own creativity failed, Sarah's complete dependence on other people's work and money. They were also pathetically predictable, and now I had 10 years to systematically dismantle everything they'd build. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Amy, asking if I wanted to go shopping at the mall. In my original timeline, I'd spend that afternoon buying cheap knockoffs and dreaming about owning designer pieces someday. But this time, I had different plans. I texted her back saying I was busy with a project that would change everything. Because I was. While she was wasting time at the mall, I was researching every fashion investor in the city, every emerging talent who'd been overlooked, every trend that was about to explode. I made lists of people to watch, companies to invest in, designers to either recruit or destroy, depending on their future loyalties. The most beautiful part was how easy it would be. Take Elena Vasquez, for instance, the girl whose designs Victoria would steal in 3 months. I could reach out to her now, offer her protection and support, maybe even partner with her before Victoria ever knew she existed. Not out of kindness, you understand, but because every designer I saved from Victoria's clutches was another weapon in my arsenal. I spent hours researching Marcus's future business model, the one built on exploiting young talent. I made detailed notes about every intern he'd abuse, every designer he'd cheat, every shortcut he'd take to build his empire. Knowledge was power, and I had enough knowledge to destroy him from the inside out. But it was Sarah who would be the most satisfying to take down. Daddy's money had bought her access to every opportunity, every connection, every advantage that real designers could only dream of. She'd spend the next decade writing scathing reviews that destroyed careers while producing nothing of value herself. Her weakness was her complete lack of actual talent, hidden behind a wall of privilege and other people's work. That night, I called in sick to my part-time job at the local boutique. In my original timeline, I'd worked there for 2 years, learning basic retail skills and saving money for fashion school. But this time, I had bigger plans. I walked into the most exclusive fabric district in the city, the one where real designers sourced their materials, and I bought supplies that should have been way beyond a 16-year-old's budget. The shop owner, an elderly man named Giuseppe, who'd been in the business for 40 years, raised an eyebrow when I selected silk that cost more per yard than most people made in a week. But when I started describing the construction techniques I planned to use, techniques that wouldn't be mainstream for another 5 years, his expression changed completely. "Where did you learn about bias cut integration with sustainable microfibers?" he asked, his accent thick with curiosity. I smiled and paid in cash, money I'd been saving for college but now had much better uses for. "I have very good instincts," I told him, which was technically true. Back in my room that night, I laid out the fabric and began to cut. But this wasn't the desperate, hopeful sewing of my original teenage years. Every snip of the scissors was precise, deliberate, perfect. I was creating the first piece in what would become the most influential collection of the next decade, and I was doing it 10 years before anyone else would even conceive of these designs. My mother knocked on my door around midnight, asking if I was okay because she'd heard the sewing machine running for hours. I told her I was working on something important, something that would change our lives. She probably thought I was being dramatic the way teenagers are, but every word was true. As I worked, I thought about that moment when Victoria had held up my emerald dress like garbage. The humiliation, the laughter, the way they'd made me feel like nothing. But now, with steady hands and absolute knowledge of the future, I realised they'd actually done me the greatest favour of my life. They'd shown me exactly who they were, exactly how this industry worked, and exactly what I needed to do to beat them at their own game. By dawn, I'd finished the first piece. A jacket that combined traditional tailoring with revolutionary, sustainable techniques, using design elements that wouldn't trend for another 3 years. It was perfection, and I knew it. More importantly, I knew exactly which fashion blogger would feature it first, which influencer would make it viral, and which magazine editor would declare it the future of fashion. I also knew that when Victoria saw it, she'd try to copy it, just like she always did. But this time, I'd be ready for her. The fashion world has a funny way of eating its own. 6 months after I'd started my quiet revolution, the first domino fell exactly as I'd orchestrated it. Elena Vasquez was showing her collection at a small gallery downtown. The same designs that Victoria would have stolen and claimed as her own breakthrough moment. But this time, Elena wasn't alone. She had a mysterious young mentor who'd appeared out of nowhere with unlimited resources and an uncanny ability to predict exactly what the industry needed. I watched from the back of the room as Victoria entered the gallery, her assistant trailing behind with a notebook ready to sketch anything worth stealing. She froze when she saw Eleanor's collection, the same pieces she'd planned to copy, but now they were already out there, already making waves, already beyond her reach. The confusion in her eyes was absolutely delicious. "Who is this designer?" I heard her whisper to her assistant, panic creeping into her voice for the first time in years. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd spent those 6 months systematically dismantling her entire future. Every designer she would have exploited was now under my protection. Every trend she would have claimed as her own was already public knowledge with clear attribution. Every connection she would have made was now loyal to someone else entirely. Marcus Chen was next. His big investor meeting was scheduled for the following week, the one where he'd convince a group of venture capitalists to fund his sustainable fashion startup. In my original timeline, He'd gotten $50 million and used it to build an empire on stolen labour. But this time, those same investors received an anonymous package containing detailed documentation of Marcus's real business plan, including internal emails that wouldn't be written for another 2 years. I'd fabricated nothing. Every piece of evidence was true, just pulled from a future that only I remembered. The beauty of having lived through their crimes once was that I knew exactly what evidence to create ahead of time. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. Marcus emerged from that glass tower looking like he'd been hit by a truck, his dreams of easy money evaporating in real time. Within hours, word had spread through the investor community. Marcus Chen was untouchable, his reputation destroyed before he'd even had the chance to build it properly. But it was Sarah Williams who provided the most entertainment. Daddy's little princess had been writing anonymous blog posts, tearing apart young designers, using her connections to get her reviews published in major magazines. She thought she was untouchable, protected by family money and institutional power. She was wrong. I'd spent weeks studying her writing style, her schedule, her patterns. Then I created my own anonymous blog, one that systematically dismantled every review she'd ever written, exposing the borrowed opinions, the plagiarized phrases, the complete lack of original thought. But the masterstroke was when I revealed that her supposed insider knowledge came entirely from Daddy's country club connections, not from any actual understanding of fashion. The post went viral overnight. Fashion Twitter erupted in outrage, not just at Sarah's fraudulent reviews, but at the entire system that had allowed someone with no talent to gatekeep an industry she didn't understand. Within a week, every magazine that had published her work was quietly removing her bylines, and her father's money couldn't buy back her credibility. The three of them were finished, their futures systematically dismantled before they'd even had the chance to build them. But destroying my enemies was only half the plan. The other half was building something so magnificent, so undeniably brilliant, that the entire industry would have no choice but to bow down. My collection was ready. 24 pieces that combined traditional craftsmanship with innovations that wouldn't exist for years, sustainable techniques that solved problems the industry didn't even know it had yet. Each garment was a masterpiece, but together they formed something revolutionary. I called it temporal, a name that only I understood the true meaning of. The venue I chose for my debut show was perfect. The same gallery where I'd protected Eleanor's work, now transformed into something magical. I'd spent months cultivating relationships with the right people, dropping hints about a mysterious new designer who was about to change everything. The anticipation was electric. Fashion Week was chaos, but my show was the eye of the storm. Every major buyer was there, every influential blogger, every magazine editor who mattered. And sitting in the front row, looking increasingly uncomfortable, were Victoria, Marcus, and Sarah. They'd come expecting to scout new talent to exploit, not knowing they were about to witness their own obsolescence. The lights dimmed and my first model stepped onto the runway, wearing the jacket I'd finished that first night after my rebirth. The room went completely silent. This wasn't just fashion, it was prophecy-made fabric, the future walking down a catwalk in perfectly tailored precision. Each piece that followed was more stunning than the last. Dresses that seemed to move with their own intelligence, suits that redefined power dressing, accessories that looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood fashion's destiny rather than just its present. The audience wasn't just watching a show, they were witnessing the birth of a new era. When the final model disappeared backstage, the silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then, someone started clapping. Slowly at first, then faster, until the entire room erupted in the kind of applause that changes careers. Critics were frantically taking notes, buyers were already calculating orders, and influencers were posting photos with captions like, I just saw the future of fashion. But my eyes were fixed on the front row. Victoria looked like she'd been slapped, her face pale with the realization that everything she thought she knew about fashion had just become obsolete. Marcus was staring at his phone, probably calculating how much money he could have made if he hadn't been completely destroyed 6 months earlier. And Sarah was crying, actual tears streaming down her face as she realized that real talent looked nothing like what she'd spent years pretending to critique. The after-party was a feeding frenzy. Orders worth millions of dollars, collaboration offers from luxury brands, investors begging to fund my next collection. But the moment I'd been waiting for came when Victoria approached me, her face a mask of desperate composure. "Your work is extraordinary," she said, her voice tight with forced admiration. "I'd love to discuss some opportunities for collaboration." I smiled. The same polite smile I'd worn that day she destroyed my emerald dress, and handed her my business card. It was pristine white with simple black text, Catherine Chen, designer, by appointment only. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice sweet as poison, "but I don't work with people who lack vision. Perhaps you should consider taking some basic design classes first." The recognition hit her like a physical blow. She knew that voice, those words, the exact tone I'd used. Her eyes went wide with impossible understanding, searching my face for something that couldn't possibly be there. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I'm the designer you couldn't afford to tag," I replied, turning away before she could respond. The reviews came out the next morning, and they were everything I'd known they would be. Revolutionary, prophetic, the most important collection in a decade. Every major fashion publication wanted exclusive interviews. Every luxury retailer wanted to carry my pieces. Every fashion school wanted me to teach masterclasses. But the real victory came 3 months later when I received an invitation to judge the same competition that had destroyed me in my original timeline. The irony was so perfect, I almost laughed out loud. They wanted the mysterious genius designer, Catherine Chen, to evaluate young talent, to decide who had what it took to make it in this industry. I accepted, of course. The day of judging arrived, and I sat in the same chair Victoria had occupied when she held up my dress like garbage. The same harsh fluorescent lights, the same sterile white studio, the same crushing pressure that had broken me once before. But this time, I was the one with the power. The contestants filed in, nervous and hopeful, clutching portfolios that contained their dreams and futures. They looked exactly like I had 10 years ago, or 10 years from now, depending on how you counted time. Young, talented, desperate to prove themselves to an industry that devoured the weak and elevated the ruthless. And there, standing in the back of the group, was a girl in a hand-stitched emerald dress. She was shaking slightly, her portfolio gripped so tight her knuckles had gone white, and when she looked at me, there was something hauntingly familiar in her eyes. The same desperate hope, the same crushing fear, the same naive belief that talent and hard work would be enough. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I could destroy her with a word, just like Victoria had destroyed me. I could laugh at her amateur stitching, mock her pedestrian design, send her home broken and defeated. The symmetry would be perfect, the circle complete. But as I looked at that girl in her emerald dress, I realized something that changed everything. The real power wasn't in becoming the monster that had hurt me. The real power was in being better than they ever were. I smiled at her, a genuine smile full of encouragement and possibility. "Now that," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the studio, "is what real fashion looks like." And for the first time since my rebirth, I felt something other than revenge burning in my chest. I felt hope. The girl's face lit up like sunrise, and I knew that this time the story would have a different ending. This time talent would be recognized, dreams would be protected, and the emerald dress would get the respect it had always deserved. After all, I wasn't just here to destroy my enemies. I was here to make sure that no one would ever again have to die clutching the business card of someone who couldn't see their worth. The revolution wasn't over, it was just beginning.